What if I told you that everything you believed about medieval castles is untrue? Luxurious halls, sumptuous four-poster beds, and the romance of knightly times. This image, created by cinema and literature, has almost nothing to do with harsh reality. We are used to thinking of castles as symbols of status, security, and even luxury as the ultimate goal in the feudal world. However, in reality, it was a cold, damp, and deadly stone trap. Behind the thick walls designed to protect against enemies, lurked threats that were far more insidious than any besieging army. These threats acted slowly, imperceptibly, and affected everyone, from a simple servant to the Lord himself. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn why a simple night in a castle could be your last, and what invisible dangers lurked in every dark corner. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of medieval romance, which is a fundamental deception of our perceptions. When we imagine life in a castle, we involuntarily transfer modern concepts of comfort to it. We imagine a crackling fire in the fireplace warming the entire room, soft carpets, and cozy bedrooms. Our minds paint a picture in which the castle is the pinnacle of prosperity, the reward for power and wealth. This illusion is so strong that we refuse to believe otherwise. In reality, medieval castles were never designed for comfortable living. Their main and only function was defense. Every element of the architecture, from narrow arrow slits to massive stone walls, was subordinated not to convenience, but exclusively to military necessity. A castle was a military machine in which people had to live. Therefore, expecting it to be cozy was as pointless as expecting it from a modern tank. The main building material was stone, and it was this that became the source of the first and main problem. Stone has high thermal conductivity, which makes it an ideal bridge of cold. It does not retain heat inside the room, but actively draws it out, releasing it into the environment. In winter, the stone walls froze through, turning the interior rooms into an icy crypt. The temperature in the living quarters rarely rose above a few degrees above freezing. This cold was not just unpleasant, it was pervasive and constant. It came from the walls, from the stone floor, and could be felt even through thick fur blankets. The people who lived in castles were in a constant struggle for survival, trying to preserve their precious body heat. This cold was not a metaphor, but a physical reality that sapped strength and made the body vulnerable. We see lords and ladies in relatively light clothing in paintings, but this is an artistic convention. Reality required wearing several layers of heavy wool and fur clothing, not only outside, but also indoors, practically around the clock. Taking off these clothes before bed meant exposing oneself to a serious risk of hypothermia. Sleep in such conditions became not a rest, but another ordeal. Even the richest inhabitants of the castle could not buy themselves warmth. They could afford more firewood and more tapestries for the walls, but this only slightly mitigated the harsh conditions. The fire only warmed a small space around it, and the tapestries quickly became damp and cold to the touch. This constant, exhausting struggle against the cold was the first step in understanding why the castle was such a dangerous place to sleep. This fundamental dissonance between our imagined castle and its actual icy reality is the key to understanding its dangers. Comfort was a sacrifice made on the altar of safety, but the irony was that this very stone safety gave rise to new internal threats to health. People were protected from swords, but not from their surroundings. The contrast between the fortress outside and the trap inside was striking. A peasant's hut, built of wood and clay, with a low thatched roof, was often warmer and drier than a lord's stone chambers. It retained heat better and suffered less from condensation. Thus, the high status of the castle owner condemned him to live in conditions that we would today consider completely unsuitable. This harsh truth is just the tip of the iceberg, the first of many factors that turned sleeping in a castle into Russian roulette. People fell asleep not knowing if they would wake up healthy. This stone cage was the perfect environment for other, even more insidious threats to develop. We would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about this contrast between fiction and the reality of medieval life? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new episodes. Are you ready to learn the truth about why the walls of a medieval castle literally wept? If cold was a constant enemy, dampness was its faithful ally, and together they created truly unbearable conditions. Most castles were built for strategic reasons, on hills, near rivers or lakes, and often surrounded by moats filled with water. This provided protection but guaranteed constant high humidity. Stone walls, lacking modern waterproofing materials and drainage systems, absorbed moisture from the ground like a sponge. Rainwater seeped through the roofs and ran down the walls, making them wet to the touch. Medieval construction techniques simply did not have effective methods to combat this phenomenon. Moisture was a fact of life that had to be accepted.
There's no stopping it.
But even without external sources of moisture, the castle generated it in huge quantities itself. This process is called condensation. Inside the rooms, fires burned and dozens of people breathed. This warm, moist air rose and came into contact with the icy stone walls. As a result, water droplets instantly formed on the walls and ceiling, which dripped down, creating constant drizzle. This moisture saturated absolutely everything. Wooden furniture, expensive clothes, bedding. Nothing could stay dry. The straw mattresses on which most of the inhabitants slept turned into a damp, rotting mass. Wool and fur blankets became heavy and cold, not warming but rather drawing heat from the body. Imagine the feeling of going to bed that feels not just cool, but downright wet. Sleeping in such conditions was pure torture. The body expended enormous resources not on recovery, but simply on warming itself and evaporating moisture from the bed. This led to chronic hypothermia and exhaustion. The dampness inevitably led to mold growth. Black and green spots covered the walls, wooden beams, and even fabrics. The air in the castle was heavy and musty, filled with fungal spores. Breathing such air was not only unpleasant, but also extremely harmful. It put a constant strain on the respiratory system, leading to illness. Clothes taken off at night did not dry by morning, but became even more damp. In the morning, people had to put on cold, wet clothes. This daily ritual was a shock to the body and another step towards a deteriorating health. Attempts to dry anything by the fire were ineffective, as there was too much moisture in the room. To combat this phenomenon, wealthy lords used wooden panels to cover the walls. This created a small air gap and made the wall less cold to the touch. However, this was only a cosmetic measure. Moisture continued to accumulate behind the panels, creating ideal conditions for wood rot and mold growth. Constant exposure to such an environment had a cumulative effect. It was not an acute threat that could kill overnight, although this did happen in cases of severe hypothermia. It was a slow poison that sapped strength day after day and left a person defenseless against any other ailments. Dampness was the foundation on which all the other dangers of the castle grew. People tried to combat it, but their methods were limited. They aired out the rooms, but this only let in more cold and often damp air. They burned more wood, but this increased the temperature contrast and intensified condensation. It was a vicious circle. But how did they try to hide this pervasive dampness and make life a little more comfortable? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret that turned the castle's most expensive and luxurious decoration into a major health hazard. What I am about to show you is hidden behind the beautiful and rich images of medieval tapestries that we so appreciate in museums. These massive woven canvases were not just decorations, but a necessity of life. They served two important functions. First, they demonstrated the status and wealth of the owner, and second, they served as the main protection against the cold coming from the stone walls. They were hung at a distance from the stone to create an air gap and block icy drafts. At first glance, it was a brilliant solution. Tapestries did indeed make rooms visually warmer and a little more comfortable. However, this luxurious drapery had a dark side that is rarely considered. Woolen fabrics that hung for years, even decades, without any cleaning, turned into giant collectors of dust, soot from fireplaces, and moisture condensing on the walls. They absorbed all the smells of the castle, became heavy with dampness, and provided the perfect environment for mold. The air behind the tapestry was completely still, warm, and humid, the perfect incubator for microscopic life. But the real problem began when we looked down from the expensive walls to the floor. The stone floors were not only icy but also uneven. To insulate the floor and make it softer, it was covered with a thick layer of organic material. Everything was used: straw, hay, reeds, or fragrant herbs. This layer was supposed to provide comfort when walking and absorb everything that fell on the floor. And that was the main problem with this seemingly practical solution. Ale was spilled on these Russian straw mats. Pieces of food were dropped on them, grease from the kitchens, dirt from boots. It was not just a mat, but an organic sponge that absorbed all the waste products of life. In medieval life, it was not customary to clean up thoroughly after oneself. Everything that ended up on the floor remained on the floor, quickly sinking into a thick layer of straw. The most shocking thing was that this layer was rarely changed entirely. It was laborious and expensive. Most often, when the top layer became too dirty, a new fresh layer of reeds was simply laid on top of it. This process could be repeated many times, creating a real layer cake of rotting organic debris on the floor that accumulated over the years. This rotting carpet on the floor, combined with the dusty and damp tapestries on the walls, created a unique atmosphere in the castle. The air was heavy, stuffy, and filled with the miasma of decay. This environment was the perfect home for rodents, such as mice and rats, which found both food and shelter here. They moved freely around the castle, exacerbating the already deplorable sanitary conditions. When the castle's inhabitants went to bed, they found themselves at the epicenter of this ecological disaster. They breathed air saturated with vapors from the rotting floor and dust from old tapestries. Even if the Lord's bed was on a raised platform, it did not save him from the general atmosphere. The servants, who slept directly on the floor, were in direct contact with this source of danger. This combination turned the castle into a hotbed of problems. Tapestries and reeds, designed to create comfort, actually became a time bomb. They masked dirt, absorbed moisture, and created the perfect environment for invisible threats. Sleeping in such a room was dangerous not only because of the cold, but also because of the air itself that had to be breathed. Thus, the attempt to make life warmer led to a catastrophic deterioration in hygiene. This unique medieval problem, a combination of luxury and unsanitary conditions, was one of the main reasons why the castle was so dangerous. If you find this hidden and not so pleasant side of history fascinating, like this video and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos about survival in the Middle Ages. Guess what invisible enemy lurked in the smoke of the central hearth every night? We have already established that the castle was cold, and the only way to combat this was with fire. In the early Middle Ages, fireplaces as we know them today were rare. Large halls and even living quarters often used an open hearth located in the center of the room. This hearth was the heart of the castle, a source of heat and light, and a place for cooking. However, it was also the main source of air pollution. A special opening, a louvre, was made in the ceiling above the hearth to draw out the smoke. But this ventilation system was extremely inefficient, especially in bad weather. Most of the smoke did not escape outside, but remained inside the room, slowly spreading throughout the hall. As a result, the air in the castle was constantly filled with thick, acrid smoke. People lived and slept in an atmosphere that today we would compare to being inside a smokehouse. The walls and ceilings quickly became covered with a thick layer of sticky black soot. Not only dry firewood was used for burning, but also anything that could burn: peat, wet branches, any combustible debris. Such fuel burned poorly, emitting huge amounts of smoke and harmful substances. This smoke irritated the eyes, caused constant coughing, and made breathing difficult, which was especially dangerous during sleep. Soot and smoke settled everywhere. They got into food and water and covered bedding and clothing. People inhaled these carcinogenic particles around the clock. This had long-term health consequences, but there was also a more immediate, deadly threat lurking in the smoke. That threat was carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is produced by incomplete combustion of fuel, which was the norm in conditions of poor draft and damp wood. It has no color or smell, making it a completely invisible killer. The concentration of carbon monoxide in a smoke-filled room could quickly reach dangerous levels. Nighttime was a particularly risky time. The castle's inhabitants went to bed while the hearth continued to smolder, or it was deliberately covered with ashes to keep the coals burning until morning. This smoldering regime was ideal for the production of carbon monoxide. A sleeping person did not feel its presence, but simply fell into a sleep that could become eternal. The symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning, headache, dizziness, weakness, could easily be mistaken for ordinary fatigue or indisposition. A person felt unwell and decided to lie down, not realizing that this decision was fatal. In a closed, poorly ventilated bedroom, the concentration of gas could become lethal within a few hours. Even the advent of full-fledged fireplaces with chimneys did not completely solve the problem. Although they removed most of the smoke, their design was imperfect. Poor draft, a clogged chimney, or the wrong wind direction could cause smoke and carbon monoxide to flow back into the room. In addition, the fireplace drew warm air out of the room, creating powerful drafts of cold air from windows and doors. As a result, the castle's inhabitants were faced with a terrible choice. They could either not light the hearth and suffer from the piercing cold and dampness, or they could light a fire and breathe in acrid smoke, risking falling asleep every night and not waking up due to carbon monoxide poisoning. What was the right choice in this situation? It was a daily choice between bad and worse, and both options slowly undermined their health. But cold and smoke were not the only problems. In the next chapter, we will learn why it was almost impossible to find a secluded place to sleep and why it was dangerous. The modern concept of personal space or private life was virtually non-existent in a medieval castle. The idea of a separate bedroom for each member of the family was an unthinkable luxury. Even the lord and lady shared their chambers with servants who slept on the floor by their bed. For all the other inhabitants of the castle, the only place to sleep was the Great Hall. This hall was the center of castle life. During the day, people ate, received guests, held court, and held councils here. At night, it turned into a huge communal dormitory. After dinner, the tables and benches were moved to the walls, and dozens of people lay down to sleep right on the floor, covered with the same rotting reeds we mentioned earlier. Everyone slept together, without separation by gender or status, except for the lord himself and his family, who could retire to their own chambers. Servants, garrison soldiers, craftsmen, grooms, as well as any guests or travelers who had found shelter, all lay side by side. This created an atmosphere far from peaceful rest. Imagine trying to sleep in a room with 50 or 100 people at the same time. The hall was filled with noise, snoring, coughing, talking in one's sleep, crying children, moaning sick people. Silence was impossible. Any sleep in such conditions was superficial and intermittent, not allowing the body to fully recover. Added to the noise were the smells. We have already mentioned the stench of rotting reeds, damp tapestries, and smoke. Now add to that the smell of dozens of unwashed bodies that had been wearing the same woolen clothes for weeks. Hygiene was extremely poor, and the concentrated smell of human habitation was heavy and suffocating. Safety in such a dormitory was also a serious problem. Sleeping next to strangers, stray soldiers, or dubious pilgrims was risky. Petty theft was commonplace. Falling into a deep sleep meant the risk of waking up without your wallet or valuables. This required constant vigilance, even in your sleep. The lack of personal space also had serious psychological consequences. The inability to be alone, to be in silence, to relax, all this created enormous stress. The body was in a state of constant tension. Such rest did not restore, but only further exhausted a person. From the point of view of the spread of illness, such a concentration of people was a disaster. One sick person coughing in the common room could quickly infect dozens of people sleeping nearby. The air they all breathed was shared, as was the straw on which they all slept. Any illness spread at lightning speed. The bed itself was improvised. At best, it was a simple straw mattress or a sack stuffed with hay. Many slept simply wrapped in their cloaks, with a saddle or log under their heads. It was an uneven, hard, and often damp bed that did not allow the body to relax and led to back and joint pain. Thus, even if the castle's inhabitants avoided hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisoning, the very process of sleeping in the Great Hall was dangerous. It was dangerous because of the lack of hygiene, the risk of theft, the noise, and most importantly, the inability to get a truly restorative rest. Chronic sleep deprivation and stress made people weak and vulnerable, which in the harsh conditions of the Middle Ages was tantamount to a slow death sentence. What if I showed you a time machine and we traveled to the smelliest but most important place in a medieval castle? We are talking about the waste disposal system, which was a source of constant and deadly danger. In a world without running water and sewage systems, this problem was solved by methods that seem shocking to us today. The main sanitary facility of the castle was the wardrobe. The name sounds harmless, but in reality, it was simply a toilet. It was a small stone cubicle or niche protruding from the main wall of the castle. Inside was a stone seat with a hole that led to a long vertical shaft. This shaft did not lead to any sewage system. It led straight down beyond the castle walls. All waste fell to the base of the castle, either into a moat filled with water or simply into a cesspool at the foot of the wall. It was a simple and practical solution from an engineering point of view, but disastrous from a hygiene point of view. Imagine the smell that hung around the castle, especially in the hot summer. The moat surrounding the fortress was not a romantic water obstacle, but a foul-smelling, stagnant open sewer. Kitchen waste and other rubbish were often dumped into it. This smell penetrated back into the castle through the windows and loopholes. But it was no better inside the castle. The wardrobe shaft was, in fact, a pipe connecting the living quarters to the cesspool. Foul-smelling gases from the pit rose up the shaft and entered the room unhindered. It was almost impossible to ventilate the wardrobe. That is why, incidentally, it was given this name. It was believed that the acrid fumes repelled moths, and clothes were stored there. For those who did not want to go to the cold closet, especially at night, there was an alternative, a chamber pot. It was an ordinary pot that was kept right in the bedroom, often under the bed. After use, it remained in the room until morning, filling the air with its vapors. Sleeping in the same room with such a fragrant neighbor was commonplace. In the morning, the contents of the chamber pots were taken out by the servants. But where? In the best case, they were carried to the same wardrobe and poured into the shaft. In the worst case, and this was common practice, it was simply thrown out of the nearest window into the courtyard or into the same ditch. This made moving around the castle courtyard not only unpleasant but also risky. This system created ideal conditions for the contamination of water sources. Wells were often dug directly in the castle courtyard to provide access to water during a siege. Fecal matter dumped into the courtyard, or cesspools seeped through the soil and into the groundwater that fed these wells. People literally drank water poisoned by their own waste. They did not understand the connection between dirty water and the serious illnesses that decimated entire garrisons. They believed that if the water was clear, it was clean. This mistake was very costly, leading to regular outbreaks of serious diseases. Sleeping in a castle was dangerous because people were surrounded by their own waste. They breathed in fumes from their wardrobes, slept next to chamber pots, and drank water that could be poisoned. It was a hygienic disaster that made survival in a castle a daily struggle. Do you think it was possible to avoid these problems in those conditions? But that wasn't all. In the next chapter, we'll talk about guests who weren't invited but felt at home in the castle. A medieval castle was not just a home for people, it was an ideal ecosystem for rodents to thrive. Huge food supplies, relative warmth from hearths, and plenty of hiding places made it a paradise for mice and rats. They were constant companions to humans in that era, and fighting them was virtually hopeless. The main magnet for rodents was the food stores. Grain, flour, dried meat, cheese. All of this was stored in the castle's barns and cellars, often in sacks or wooden barrels that were easy to gnaw through. The loss of food to rodents was enormous, which in times of famine could pose a direct threat to the survival of the garrison. But rodents were not confined to the storerooms. They moved freely throughout the castle, finding food everywhere. The rotting layers of straw on the floor of the Great Hall, which we mentioned earlier, were a real feast for them. Food scraps that fell from the table got stuck in the reeds and became easy prey. The thick stone walls of castles, which seem monolithic to us, often had internal voids, service passages, and cracks. These spaces served as ideal highways for rodents, allowing them to move freely from the basement to the Lord's chambers. They literally lived inside the walls, surrounding people on all sides. At night, when the castle was plunged into relative silence, their life began. The sleep of the castle's inhabitants was often interrupted by squeaking, gnashing, and rustling sounds. Rodents ran through the rooms, climbed onto tables, and even into beds in search of warmth and food. This created not only a disgusting but also a frightening atmosphere. The very fact of sleeping in a room infested with rodents was extremely stressful. People woke up when something ran over them or from the noise of fighting over dinner leftovers. This prevented them from getting a good night's sleep and kept their nervous system in constant tension. But the main danger of rodents was not that they ate supplies or disturbed sleep. They were carriers of serious diseases. This connection was not obvious in the Middle Ages, but it was fatal. Rodents, living in the unsanitary conditions of cesspools and rotting straw, had free access to the kitchen, water supplies, and beds. They contaminated food and surfaces, leaving behind invisible but deadly traces. Any food left on the table could be poisoned by morning. Water in an open bucket was also at risk. People lived in constant contact with sources of danger without even suspecting it. Attempts to control the rodent population were ineffective. Terriers were kept in castles and primitive traps were set, but the number of rodents was too great. The castle's ecosystem was perfectly balanced to support them, a constant source of food, water, shelter, and no natural enemies. Thus, when going to bed, the castle's inhabitants shared their dwelling with an army of uninvited guests. These guests not only encroached on their food and sleep, but also carried with them an invisible threat that could have fatal consequences for the entire garrison. It was another weight on the scales of survival that tipped the balance against humans every day. In such a hostile environment as a medieval castle, the bed itself was transformed from a simple piece of furniture into a complex engineering structure, the last line of defense. We admire massive four-poster beds, seeing them as a symbol of luxury. But in the Middle Ages, every detail of this structure had a purely practical and vital purpose. The base of such a bed was a sturdy wooden frame that raised the sleeper as high as possible above the icy stone floor. This was important in order to avoid the coldest air that accumulated at the bottom, as well as to be away from rotting straw, dirt, and rodents scurrying across the floor. The height of the bed was the first level of protection. The main elements were four posts at the corners, which supported the frame for the canopy, and heavy curtains. These curtains, often made of thick wool, velvet, or tapestry fabric, were a key element of survival. At night, they were tightly drawn on all four sides, creating an enclosed space, a room within a room. The main purpose of this fabric cocoon was to conserve heat. The heat exhaled by the sleepers, and the heat from their bodies remained inside this small space, allowing the temperature to be kept a few degrees higher than in the rest of the freezing room. This was the only way to avoid freezing to death in the coldest nights. The second function of the curtains was to protect against drafts. Narrow loophole windows and cracks in the walls created constant icy air currents. The thick fabric blocked these drafts, which could be not only unpleasant but dangerous, leading to hypothermia in the sleeper. The third function was privacy. As we already know, even lords shared their bedrooms with servants. Drawn curtains were the only way to achieve at least the illusion of privacy in a world where personal space was non-existent as a class. This was important for psychological comfort. However, this ingenious design had a downside. By creating a warm enclosed cocoon, the curtains completely blocked any air circulation. If the fireplace was lit or candles were used in the room, all the carbon monoxide and smoke that did not escape through the chimney could accumulate in this space. Breathing stale, heavy, oxygen-depleted air all night long was extremely unhealthy. The mattress itself was also a problem. It was not a spring mattress, but a large bag tightly stuffed with straw, dry leaves, or, in very wealthy homes, feathers. The straw quickly became matted, stiff, and uncomfortable. Worse still, it absorbed moisture from the damp air and the sleeper's sweat, causing it to rot from the inside. This straw mattress had to be turned regularly, dried and refilled, but this was not done as often as it should have been. As a result, the mattress became a breeding ground for mold and mildew, which brought us back to the problem of poor air quality that the sleeper had to breathe. The bed designed to protect itself became a source of danger. Thus, the bed was a fortress within a fortress. It protected against the cold, drafts, and prying eyes. But it also locked a person in a stuffy, unventilated box with a rotting mattress, exposing them to the risk of carbon monoxide poisoning and breathing problems. It was another compromise that had to be made for the sake of survival. The threat to those sleeping in the castle came not only from the environment, but also from what they ate and drank before bed. The system of food storage and preparation in the Middle Ages was another risk factor that could make a night in the castle fatal. Digestive problems, which seem like a minor annoyance to us today, could lead to serious health problems in that era. Let's start with water, the most basic resource. As we have already established, wells in the castle courtyard were extremely vulnerable to contamination. It was common for waste from cesspools and closets to seep into the groundwater. People drank water that was far from clean. Because of this, the safest drinks were not water, but ale, beer, and wine. The fermentation process killed most dangerous bacteria, making these drinks preferable. However, this meant that people, including the nobility, consumed alcohol from morning to night. Falling asleep in a state close to intoxication was the norm, which only exacerbated the danger of carbon monoxide poisoning. A drunk person might simply not wake up from its effects. Food storage was no better. There were no refrigerators, and the main methods of preservation were salting, smoking, drying, and curing. Meat and fish were salted in huge quantities, making them practically inedible without long soaking. But even these methods did not always prevent spoilage. Food was often on the verge of being inedible. There was no clear understanding of bacteria and expiration dates. If meat began to smell, it was not thrown away. It was generously sprinkled with spices, pepper, cloves, nutmeg, to mask the unpleasant smell and taste. These expensive spices were valued not only for their taste, but also for their masking properties. Eating a piece of such prepared meat for dinner was commonplace. The consequences in the form of severe stomach upset were predictable. In conditions of total unsanitary conditions and dirty water, even simple indisposition could quickly turn into dehydration and become life-threatening. The kitchens in the castles themselves were far from sterile. Huge hearths, soot, food scraps, all this attracted rodents and created a favorable environment for bacteria to multiply. Food was prepared in conditions that today would lead to the immediate closure of any establishment. Grains stored in barns suffered not only from rodents, but also from dampness. Ergot, a fungus that caused severe poisoning, hallucinations, and convulsions when it got into flour and bread, could develop on it. People ate this bread without understanding the cause of their suffering. Thus, the castle's inhabitants went to bed after drinking a mug of ale to avoid drinking poisoned water and eating a piece of heavily salted and peppered meat of dubious freshness. Their bodies were forced to fight not only the cold and dampness, but also potential poisoning. This turned every night into a test for his digestive and immune systems. In addition to all the physical threats, cold, dampness, carbon monoxide, unsanitary conditions, and rodents, there was another equally important danger: psychological terror. The environment of a medieval castle not only weighed heavily on the human body, it also exhausted the mind. Everyone who lived within its stone walls felt this constant tension. During the day, it was possible to drown it out with work, noise, and conversation. But at night, the full weight of the pressure became particularly acute. Sleep became a trial rather than a rest. Life in the castle was associated with a feeling of eternal alertness. High walls, heavy doors, and narrow passageways were built for defense, but they created a feeling of isolation. People lived in a space that itself was a reminder of possible danger. Even in times of relative peace, fear did not let go. It was the backdrop that accompanied every night. This made rest superficial and anxious. Sleep in such conditions was far from peaceful and restorative. The inhabitants of the castle went to bed knowing that any sound could be the beginning of danger. In such conditions, the body never completely relaxed. It was in a state of semi-readiness, like a soldier in a fortified camp. Therefore, even if a person slept for many hours, they woke up exhausted. The psychological stress was constant. First of all, the castle was almost completely dark. Unlike today, people had no access to electric lighting or streetlights. In the Middle Ages, light was an expensive and hard-to-get resource. Lights had to be saved because candles cost money, fat cost labor, and torches could cause fires. So at night, the castle was plunged into deep darkness. This darkness had a depressing effect on the psyche. The only sources of light were the hearth, torches, and candles. But even these weak sources could not always be used. Ordinary people often had to make do with smoky torches, which gave off little light and a lot of smoke. Tallow lamps smelled unpleasant and could smoke so much that it became difficult to breathe in the room. Wax candles were a real luxury. Therefore, only the lord, his family, and clergy used them. For most of the castle's inhabitants, the evening was spent in shadows and half-tones. There was barely enough light to distinguish the outlines of objects. Any movement became dangerous because one could trip, bump into a weapon, or stumble upon the embers of the hearth. People got used to living in this poverty of light, but it was still oppressive. Darkness became part of everyday life. It created an atmosphere of anxiety. At night, for the sake of economy and fire safety, most of the lights were extinguished. This meant that when darkness fell, the castle literally disappeared from the world. People found themselves in a space where there was neither depth nor form. This darkness had nothing in common with the cozy shadows of our time. It was heavy and alien, as if alive. It was easy to feel fear in it. The castle was plunged into impenetrable darkness. The inhabitants knew every step, every protrusion of the wall, but at night it all became dangerous. Even a small step could lead to injury. Therefore, people tried not to move unnecessarily. They went to bed earlier simply because the darkness deprived them of the opportunity to do anything. Life seemed to freeze. The darkness concealed all the threats we have mentioned. It made mice, rats, and other nocturnal sounds invisible. In these conditions, any rustle could be a source of fear. People listened to the silence, and the silence responded with frightening sounds. In the darkness, the imagination worked much harder. This increased anxiety. Sounds were heightened in the darkness. The howling of the wind in the battlements sounded like voices or screams. The creaking of beams, natural for a wooden structure, could sound like footsteps. The rustling of rodents spread through the stone corridors as if someone were walking in the rooms. These sounds threw people off balance. The castle at night had a life of its own, and it was not always friendly. The castle itself was a fortress built out of fear. People knew that the walls around them existed only because behind them lay a world of danger. Inside the castle, it was cramped and cold, but outside it was even worse. Therefore, fear became part of the architecture. It lived in every hall, every tower, and every dungeon. The castle instilled vigilance in people. It was a symbol of the constant threat of attack. Even if the threat was only potential, people felt it. In the Middle Ages, the world was never completely safe. Bandits, enemy raids, clashes between feudal lords, all of this was a reality. Therefore, every knock at night could be a signal of alarm. Sleep became a vulnerable moment. At night, every sound could be interpreted as a warning. Even if there was no real danger, fear made people listen. Guards on the wall shouted passwords and warnings to signal their presence. These voices did not reassure, but reminded of the possibility of danger. The castle lived at night like a besieged space. It was part of everyday life. The sentries on the walls, their rare shouts. All this served as a reminder that the world outside the walls was hostile. These sounds were the only confirmation that someone was keeping watch. But they were also ghosts that broke the silence. Each shout could wake the sleepers, and each time the heart would respond with a quick beat. This prevented the restoration of strength. For the inhabitants of the Great Hall, sleep was fraught with stress due to the lack of personal space. People slept close to each other, often with their entire family, sometimes with neighbors. The noise of neighbors, their movements, and conversations made it difficult to fall asleep. The constant feeling of other people's bodies around them was oppressive. Even at night, they had to keep their belongings close at hand. Theft inside the castle was rare, but not unheard of. They had to guard their belongings so as not to lose the most necessary things. The poor, who had little property, especially cherished every little thing. If clothes or tools went missing, it was a real tragedy. Therefore, people slept on guard. This vigilance did not allow them to relax. It drained their strength. For the lord and lady, locked behind the curtains of their bed, the darkness brought other fears. Their beds were arranged like small rooms, into which no light penetrated. The curtains made the space cramped and stuffy. Smoke or fumes could accumulate inside because the air did not circulate well. This created a feeling of claustrophobia. Even privileged people suffered from these conditions. Claustrophobia in a stuffy cocoon, or fear of invisible carbon monoxide, made sleep restless. They knew that staying too long near the hearth could be deadly. The gas was invisible, and no one could tell when there would be too much of it. Therefore, even noble people did not feel completely safe. Their peace of mind was an illusion. At night, everyone was equal in the face of danger. Chronic sleep deprivation was the norm. People rarely slept continuously, often waking up from the cold, noise, or their own anxieties. The body did not get proper rest and lived as if in constant anticipation. This weakened a person from within. They became vulnerable to disease. Lack of sleep slowly destroyed their health. Poor air quality exacerbated this condition. Dust, smoke, and humidity irritated the respiratory system. People coughed and suffered from colds and other illnesses. There was almost never any fresh air in the castle, especially in winter. Dampness seeped into the body and joints. This prevented people from recovering their strength after a hard day. This led to a weakened immune system. The body, constantly under stress, was unable to fight off infections. Diseases spread quickly and affected many residents at once. The conditions in the castle meant that infections could last for weeks. Lack of sleep made any illness worse. People seemed to slowly melt away. This cumulative effect was the most frightening threat. Each of these problems could be tolerable on its own, but together they created a combination that undermined the body on a daily basis. Cold, dampness, poor air quality, unsanitary conditions, rodents, questionable food, and psychological stress worked as a single mechanism. They turned the castle into a dangerous place for health. This impact was subtle but constant. We took a trip behind the scenes of the romantic myth and saw that the medieval castle was far from a fairy tale image. It was, first and foremost, a military fortress where comfort was sacrificed for security. But as we discovered, it was this stone security that gave rise to many internal, invisible, and deadly threats. Pervasive dampness and cold turned the rooms into icy crypts. Acrid smoke and invisible carbon monoxide from the hearths poisoned the air. Catastrophic, unsanitary conditions, where waste polluted the water and living quarters. Rotten reed floors and dusty tapestries that served as a home for rodents. Finally, constant stress, darkness, and lack of normal rest. All of this together turned sleep in the castle into a daily test of survival. This harsh reality shows how resilient and tenacious the people of that era were, and how much our ideas about basic comfort and safety have changed. What other aspects of survival in the Middle Ages would you like us to explore? Perhaps you are interested in medieval medicine, the diet of a simple peasant, or the dangers of travel? Suggest your topics in the comments, and we will be sure to make an episode about it. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on new dives into the harsh but fascinating history of survival.